afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Martha Tredici, the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museums. Today, I'm delighted to welcome each of you to the virtual opening celebration of the exhibition, Devour the Land, War and American Landscape Photography since 1970. As is our practice, we begin this afternoon's lecture with a formal land acknowledgement. The Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that the museums and Harvard University are situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor that relationship to this place. Although we are gathering on Zoom this afternoon, and many of you are joining us from across time zones, which we're thrilled about, I want to celebrate the fact that the Harvard Art Museums are open and this groundbreaking exhibition is officially on view for in-person visitors as of today. If you are within visiting distance, we look forward to seeing you in the galleries very soon. Today's program asks us to think about the meaning of place in a different way. Photographs are often described as bearing witness, as a kind of silent and objective reportage of events, both public and private. The artists featured in Devour the Land remind us that photographs are usually anything but passive documentation. Their work is an active invitation to look beyond the surface at what is implied, a call to attention, and at times a call to action. Mounting a presentation like this with more than 150 works that offer a multiplicity of stories from many artists and from across the country would not have been possible without the help from friends old and new. I have the privilege of thanking our partners for helping us to realize this crucial project. This exhibition is made possible in part by the generosity of the Terra Foundation for American Art and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. And I want to extend a warm welcome to our colleagues from each of these foundations who are joining us today, as well as a sincere thank you for your partnership. Additional support is provided by the Rosenblatt Fund for the post-war American art, and the exhibition's related programming is supported by the M. Victor Leventritt Lecture Series Endowment Fund. Contemporary and modern art programs at the Harvard Art Museums are also made possible in part by generous support from the Emily Ralph Pulitzer and Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Fund for Modern and Contemporary Art. I want to extend a warm welcome as well to our friends, fellows, and members of the photography committee, all of whom have been critical partners in this and many other endeavors. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Makeda Best. Dr. Makeda Best is the Richard L. Menschel Curator of Photography, and she is responsible for the museum's photography collections. She earned her MA and PhD from Harvard, and her scholarly interests focus on 19th and 20th century American photography, with a special expertise in photojournalism, documentary and war photography, and text image work. Beyond her curatorial work, Makeda is a sought-after teacher, speaker, and mentor on the Harvard campus. Makeda has recently curated the exhibitions, Crossing Lines, Constructing Home, Displacement and Belonging in Contemporary Art, and Winslow Homer Eyewitness, both in 2019, as well as Time Is Now, Photography and Social Change in James Baldwin's America in the Carpenter Center in 2018. She has also been instrumental in sparking a new interrogation of the permanent collection at the Harvard Art Museums. The Reframe Project, as we're calling it, which is kicking off this fall and will continue over the next 2 to 3 years. Stay tuned for that. With that, please join me in welcoming and congratulating Makeda Best on her exhibition. Makeda, over to you.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you all for joining me this afternoon. The title of this exhibition comes from the American Civil War era. Quote, "We have devoured the land," wrote Union Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was describing the damage wrought by his troops, some 10 million acres of wasted land in Georgia alone, during one of the most destructive campaigns known as the March to the Sea during 1864 and 1865. Sherman's Special Field Orders, number 120, instructed troops to, quote, "enforce a devastation more or less relentless," to, in other words, to ransack farms and indiscriminately set fires to eliminate the transportation and industrial infrastructure that sustained the Confederate Army. Even then, witnesses to Sherman's scorched earth tactics understood the environmental tragedy in part as an aesthetic event. Wrote one observer, quote, "The effect of these peculiar watchfires on every side, with flames licking their way up the tall trunks, was particularly striking and beautiful." Photographer George Barnard, working as the official photographer for the United States Army Division of the Mississippi, followed Sherman's army. Barnard's 61 photographs, compiled in his photographic book, Photographic Views of Sherman's Campaign, capture the details and scale of the wreckage, eerily suggesting a sense of the forward motion of the armies. His frequently elevated vantage points heighten the graphic qualities of darkened patches of earth, upended trains, and fields of ragged stumps and broken tree limbs. Sherman was not alone in his actions. A year before and across the country in New Mexico, Colonel Kit Carson burned crops and confiscated resources on Navajo land. In addition to the paradox of the aesthetic beauty of destruction embedded in the actions of Sherman and his men, in Barnard's photographs and in unimaged events such as Carson's raids, are profound questions about federal power, individual rights, public oversight, conservation, and the status and function of photography. Despite the fact that wars were conducted abroad, into the modern era, the US domestic landscape continues to bear the footprint of armed conflict. Today, the majority of the environmental damage we live with was caused by our own military and the expansive network of industries supporting its work. The US military's impact on the domestic environment is the subject of Devour the Land, War in American Landscape Photography since 1970. Military sprawl in the United States, as author Tony Hiss once referred to it, is one of, quote, America's most problematic and least discussed legacies. Critic Mike Davis reinforces this point on a global scale. Was the Cold War the Earth's worst eco-disaster in the last 10,000 years? He asked. The time has come to weigh the environmental costs of the great twilight struggle and its attendant nuclear arms race. Until recently, most ecologists have tended to underestimate the impacts of warfare and arms production on natural history. End quote. Sam Murillo and Catherine Lutz are only two of the many contemporary scholars whose work addresses militarism, war cycles, and the domestic home front. Photographers have done their part to take up this issue, scrutinizing the legacy of the Cold War and thereby expanding the history of American environmental photography. Indeed, their work has created new contexts for understanding the influences and transformations of the medium, as well as its role in public life. Today, the collective footprint of the divisions of the Department of Defense dwarfs that of any corporation. These include military bases, training ranges, and more. But of course, the DoD also manages varying acreages in the US territories and additional acres overseas, producing more hazardous waste than the 5 largest US chemical companies combined. The DoD has left its toxic legacy in the form of depleted uranium, oil, jet fuel, ammunition, pesticides, and more. For example, water at or around at least 126 military installations contains potentially harmful levels of perfluorinated compounds, which have been linked to cancers and developmental delays for fetuses and infants. Roughly 900 of the 1,200 or so Superfund sites in America are abandoned military facilities or sites that otherwise support military needs. An article in Newsweek once described, quote, a sort of toxic archipelago across the land from McClellan Air Force Base near Sacramento, California, where radioactive waste was found, to the Massachusetts military reservation on Cape Cod, poisoned by explosives and a rocket jet fuel component that is a major Pentagon pollutant. Scholars in the growing field of war and ecology discuss war's 2 impacts on the environment: direct consequences from the extraction and consumption of resources, and physical damage due to weaponry, actions, and operations, and indirect consequences that include the research to develop, test, and improve technologies and support and supply contracts that comprise the military-industrial complexes. Indirect impacts can be difficult to foresee, easily overlooked, massive in scale and geographic range, and nearly impossible to measure. Pollution and contamination can accumulate over years in soil, water, and air, and the relationship between toxin and effect can be difficult to capture. In other words, as one op-ed concluded, quote, technology is not always up to the job of cleaning up the messes it leaves behind. Straddling the genres of conflict and landscape, the photographs made during the Civil War era, as now, are unique documents of cultural and aesthetic attitudes, mythologies, values, conventions, and disruptions. They prompt such questions as, what are the rationales and risks of environmental disaster perpetuated in the name of war? What are the mechanisms of public oversight? How do actions in war solidify or change attitudes around human rights, the rights of government, and the ethics of technology? What regions of the country are most affected? Whose livelihoods are treated as expendable and whose are spared? How do photographs record impacts and raise awareness? Conversely, how do they abstract impacts and deflect awareness? What are the functions of images of environmental harm as art and as documents? Following a trajectory that originates in the 19th century, Devour the Land begins in the 1970s, a period of environmental activism, new directions in photography, and the ongoing expansion of the US military. By the start of the decade, anxiety about the health of the natural world had come to the attention of the American public. Scientist Barry Commoner wrote in his 1971 bestseller, The Closing Circle, Man, Technology, and Nature, quote, our assaults on the ecosystem are so powerful, so numerous, so finely interconnected that although the damage they do is clear, it is very difficult to discover how it was done, by which weapon, in whose hand. The decade saw a historic rush to action. Popular publications, grassroots activism, media attention, and new federal legislation, in addition to the first Earth Day celebration, helped dub the 1970s the environmental decade. Land use, land, geography, and the built environment were well established as core subjects of photography and as intrinsic aspects of its popular identity and sense of public utility and the focus of its practical and theoretical literature. The watershed moment of the 1970s prompted a range of responses to new interpretations of this history of land-based photographic image making. Military buildup during the Cold War, environmental consciousness as a political and cultural force, and changes in land-based photographic practices are the subjects of the first section of the exhibition titled Silent Spring, which takes its name from the scientist and writer Rachel Carson's seminal 1962 book. Unease with celebratory images of the land and attention to the disconnection between people and their environment were conveyed most influentially by the photographers associated with the landmark exhibition, New Topographics, Photographs of a Man-Altered Landscape. Curated by William Jenkins, who also authored the short but widely read catalog, the exhibition opened at George Eastman Museum in Rochester in 1975. Using flat tonalities and mundane perspectives, the photographers of New Topographics portrayed the vernacular contemporary landscape, subdivisions, industrial parks, parking lots, suburban construction sites, rather than epic wonders, rebuking a decades-long tradition in American landscape practice. Though this period is known to specialists for the work of photographers associated with New Topographics, Devour the Land navigates a broader photographic landscape that includes activist photography and recognizes such ambitious projects as the Long Island Project. Frida Leinwand's demonstrators, for example, suggest how the rhetoric of environmentalism was received and quickly became part of American cultural life. Dorothy Martyr's documentation of environmental protests engaged diverse voices and document protest strategies. Mina Cataldo continued this kind of work. Her photographs movingly show protesters confronting the horror of militarism's threat with performance and dance. Meanwhile, photographer Peter Schlesinger conceived of a multi-year survey called the Long Island Project. Supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Olympus Corporation, and inspired by the Farm Security Administration photography of the 1930s, a dozen photographers set about the task of exploring Long Island as a microcosm of America, the study of which would offer, quote, an extensive range of environments in which to observe the problems and pleasures of the post-World War II pursuit of the American dream. Looming in the images of beachgoers, gas stations, and cheerleaders is the presence of war and preparations for combat. The collective known as the Atomic Photographers Guild was founded in 1987 and is still active today. Led by Canadian photographer Robert Del Tredici and the American photographer Carol Gallagher, the group's international membership documents, quote, the history, impact, and ongoing legacy of the atomic age, emphasizing nuclear weapons and mass production, atomic testing and proliferation, nuclear power, reactor accidents, radioactive waste containment, irradiated landscapes, and radiation-affected populations. In his 1961 farewell address, President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned, quote, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. And yet, in the decades that followed, the branches of the nation's armed forces, along with the associated network of private and commercial institutions involved in the production of weapons and military technologies, expanded exponentially. The photographs in the exhibition's second section, the exhibition's core, is titled Arming America, and it navigates the nationwide footprint of the defense industry. Some featured photographers literally document this toxic map. As they chart this geography, they utilize strategies to illustrate the complicated presence and legacies of invisible toxins and pollutants. During the late 1980s, for example, Barbara Norfleet's work advocating for local policies around land use contributed to her interest in pursuing the topic on a national scale. A story in the New York Times about an accident at the Savannah River nuclear manufacturing facility introduced her to pollution at former military sites. She then embarked on what would become her portfolio, Landscapes of the Cold War. Flanking each photograph in David T. Hansen's Wilderness to Landscape Wasteland series is a map and documentation by the Environmental Protection Agency. The project took him from New Jersey to Arizona, Minnesota, Washington State, and more. Hanson's inversion of the human position eliminates the tendency to ascribe awe-inspiring beauty to deadly technologies, as did this observer in 1945 after witnessing an atomic test. Quote, "The whole country was lighted by a searing light with the intensity many times that of the midday sun. It was golden, purple, violet, gray, and blue. It lighted every peak, crevice, and ridge of the nearby mountain range with a clarity and beauty that cannot be described, but must be seen to be imagined. It was that beauty that the great poets dreamed, but could describe most poorly and inadequately." EPA documentation also appears in Frederica Armstrong's work. Armstrong has photographed Superfund sites in Silicon Valley for her series In Plain Sight. Created in cities with names like Sunnyvale and Mountain View, Armstrong's photographs portray routine activities. The warm tone seemingly conjures a sense of optimism and escape. Reading the captions, which consist of their EPA classification numbers and current status, Armstrong informs the viewer of what else they are seeing. Silicon Valley is so named for its history in manufacturing the silicon-based circuit chips and transistors that fueled technological innovation. Now, what is less well known is that the US Air Force was one of the first proponents of microelectronics research and development, the technology that would support the creation of weapons such as the supersonic B-70 bomber and the Minuteman nuclear missile. Dangerous chemical solvents involved in the making of microelectronics were often disposed of haphazardly, while some companies stored waste underground in containers that later leaked toxins into the groundwater. Others did not even attempt such precautions. The Nevada desert is a recurring subject in the work of photographers seeking to trace military impact. As described by one member of the Army Air Corps, quote, "The land was cheap because it really wasn't much good for anything but gunnery practice. You could bomb it into oblivion and never notice the difference." It was Nevada where Richard Misrak began his series, Bravo 20, The Bombing of the American West, in 1986. Like Misrak, Emmett Gowan's nearly surreal crater-filled landscape grapples with the evidence of destructive action. His perspective contextualizes the site as earthbound. As the scene stretches far beyond what the eye can see, the image transforms the space out there to be distinctly here and connected to us. Where the shock of light once came to symbolize ultimate annihilation, Gowan instead embraces the spirit of creation. Quote, "The earth is like our body. It has a circulatory system, it has skin, it has energy, has bowels deep inside, and has this driving force." Other photographers focus on specific kinds of sites. Decommissioned bases, former training sites, abandoned factories, pockmarked landscapes. These sites of military-driven environmental harm can be interpreted as sites of aftermath. A diminished sense of global threat, together with the desire to balance budgets, led to an unprecedented closure of military bases across the country between 1988 and 1995. This decision saved the US government billions, but many of the sites were heavily polluted and empty structures contributed to blight. Once symbolic of military might and economic stability, the former sites do more than mark the end of the era of American power. They remind viewers of the military's vast land holdings and their costs that extend far beyond the time of use. Joshua Dudley Greer spent 3 years photographing the bunkers and polluted wetlands of West Virginia's Clifton F. McClintock Wildlife Management Area. Referred to locally as the TNT area, the park was once a massive weapons manufacturing facility that produced hundreds of thousands of pounds of TNT, the surplus of which was stored underground in concrete igloos. Some sites in the exhibition are well known. In the Cascade Mountains, image made in the Pacific Northwest, Chien Sim documents how the mountains runoff provided water to cool the nuclear reactor at the nearby Hanford site, established as part of the Manhattan Project. Water fueled testing, while testing itself contaminated groundwaters. Today, disproportionate rates of cancers and other illnesses afflict individuals living near Hanford and the Nevada test site, and they are known as downwinders. While other sites in the exhibition have only recently gained national attention. Alex Webb photographed Tredici, a small nearby abandoned town in Cherokee County, Kansas, for the New York Times. The dramatic rise in the demand for lead, zinc, and iron during World War I made Tredici a boomtown. Metals stripped from the area were used to produce most of the ammunition for the armed forces during both world wars. Eventually, little remained to extract. Companies made fortunes and left behind mountains of rock and collapsed mine shafts, filled today with thick, off-colored water and trash. Other photographers in this section remind us of histories that have been overlooked by both mainstream America and environmental photography. Zig Jackson's series, Indian Man in San Francisco, and his other series, Entering Zig's Indian Reservation, implicitly addressed the militarization of native homelands and displacement of indigenous peoples. This work, made in the San Francisco Bay Area, home to diverse peoples collectively known as the Ohlone. The Marin Headlands, part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, is also the site of a number of military fortifications, bunkers, batteries, and missile silos. The first military installations were built there in the 1890s to prevent hostile ships from entering the bay. Similarly, before the city became known for its colorful Victorian homes, the military utilized large sections of San Francisco, including the port of embarkation, Fort Mason, and the Presidio. By turning the camera on himself, Jackson continues the tradition of Bay Area activism, such as the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz by Native protesters, claiming sovereignty not only here over his image, but the ground beneath him as well. The Arming America section also includes photo-based artist books. In the late 1970s and 1980s, a number of female artists began to create photographically based bookworks in response to what they saw as the era's most pressing social and political issues. These included gay rights and the women's rights movements, threats to the environment, exemplified most seriously by the 1979 accident at Exelon's 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station. New funding streams for book-based art production and workshops made bookworks more attractive as a medium. Often made with a Xerox machine or produced as multiples, these projects were able to uniquely engage, question, and disrupt official messages from the media and corporations by incorporating text from newspapers and magazines, for example, or adopting the visual language of agitprop. Communities of color are often overlooked in environmental photography, and they are the focus of the next section, Slow Violence. Quote, they and their worlds, writes photographer and critic Deborah Bright, are absent from view in almost all publicized art photography exhibitions and publications that address environmental issues. They have been displaced and rendered invisible by the foregrounding of an abstract, apolitical fiction of nature that an equally abstract humanity has despoiled. This section takes its title from a phrase coined by environmental studies scholar Rob Nixon, which he describes as, quote, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Environmental damage and the economic fallout wrought by the military-industrial complex is most acutely felt by poor communities, both rural and urban, and communities of color across the country. To provide a sense of how large this sector is, it is useful to recognize that at one point recently, 40% of the industrial plants and equipment in America were devoted to military manufacturing. Steel mills and chemical manufacturing plants can be integrated into the community as opposed to military training sites and testing sites. These kinds of sites further complicate issues of invisibility and diffuseness, but they offer the possibility to explore the deeper connections of this subject to American culture and politics. Communities benefited from the economic infusion of jobs, but they struggle with the long-term effects of these industries. Sebastian Hidalgo and Eli Reed portray everyday life in such communities. Jin Lee's photographs made along a train route through Illinois feature that once powerful industrial economy that gained this region national prominence. Lee's photographs portray self-storage sites, lottery advertisements, prisons, and junk lots. Ashley Gilbertson's 2017 photograph, Frankie McRae, a veteran who served 2 tours in Iraq, hides inside his trailer on Bush Road in Colfax when the open burning of munitions takes place nearby, depicts McRae sitting in a chair as he looks at something outside of the frame. Gilbertson communicates the cruel irony that McRae risks his life abroad only to come home to live and quite possibly die from the toxins released by the very entity he once served. In another Gilbertson photograph, also from 2017, titled "A Resident Talks with Construction Workers in Protective Gear in the Contaminated Hunters Point neighborhood of San Francisco, California," the artist's vantage point allows the viewer to see structures on either side of a ditch in which workers stand and the rising up of a hill at the back of the image. Gilbertson thus embeds the ditch within a dense urban fabric. The title references only one individual, but all of the surrounding windows and doors represent a community. The presence of the suited men in the ditch is both a startling and strange detail. Because of their face masks and suits, whatever the workers are trying to do seems both urgent and dangerous. The woman leaning into the site wears no such clothing or gear. Dividing the image is a chain link fence, separating residents from workers. More than that, as if to underscore the vulnerability of low-income people, the chain link fence is merely propped up against another fence, secured only with a thin wire that resembles a piece of a hanger. Further explored in the work of Stacy Kranitz, environmental problems are not extricable from issues of racism, land use, and land management. In her series made in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, as it's called, Kranitz's project is an act of historical excavation. Her vivid photographs document the contemporary life of residents struggling against corporations and legislation that has rendered generations ill from various diseases. She demonstrates the ways in which communities live with these corporations in their everyday lives and built environments. We can't see the pollution or toxicity, but the photographs seem to remind us that nor can we see the disease that ravages the region. Many of the communities she records in her series, Fulcrum of Malice, were either former plantations or communities established by formerly enslaved people in the 18th and 19th centuries. Each site represents a dense story of military contractors and subcontractors, lax oversight, corruption, blatantly illegal activity, pollution, race, and poverty. Nixon again, quote, "Violence is customarily conceived as an event or action that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular in space, and as erupting into instant sensational visibility. We need, I believe, to engage a different kind of violence, a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and appreciative, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales." Paradoxically, environmental toxicity can also contribute to adaptation and regeneration. The photographs in the section titled "Regeneration" address such instances. Quote, "The mysteries of the abandoned human stories combined with nature's changes drew photographer Terry Evans to photograph a former arsenal in Illinois. In such images, sites that humans have abandoned or cannot safely enter can also become sites where the natural world takes new form." The Mattias Petrochemical Company is an active chemical distribution facility on the National Priorities List, a registry of US sites where hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants have been released or at risk of being released, making them eligible for remediation financing under the federal Superfund program. The composition of Toter's photograph from his ongoing series on the priorities list compresses our view of the 2-acre facility. Closed off on 2 sides by black plastic fencing, the scene is seemingly open-ended at the right. The pits, mounds, discarded equipment, and structures suggest the various kinds of cleanup, coordination, and labor taking place and the immense challenges involved for this and for every other site on the list. Preparations for armed conflict are not the only ways in which war affects the home front. The next section considers other contemporary wars on the domestic soil while also acknowledging the U.S. military's international footprint, and it is titled Other Battlefields. On this anniversary of 9/11, we were reminded of the environmental costs of that tragedy. Some of the photographs address climate change, others remind us of the costs of our racialized environment. The decades-long war on drugs fueled a rapid and expensive increase in the nation's prison population, and beginning in the 1980s. This in turn fed a boom in prison construction, many of them built and operated by private companies. The transformation of rural America into a sprawling prison network has had profound environmental impacts. The steps taken to militarize the southern border, meanwhile, both on the ground and from the air, are devastating to the habitats of plants and animals in that region. The final section is titled Resistance. Referenced in the Silent Spring section, the 1970s introduced the public to the image of modern environmental protest. Photographers of that era took up and adapted the activist model pioneered by their predecessors during the civil rights movement. In this section, portraits of contemporary organizers represent the ongoing collaboration between photographers and activists and the communities across the country that are brought together in common cause, galvanized by shared anger, loss, and determination. These photographs show us the everyday people for whom inaction is no longer an option. Devour the Land interprets militarized landscapes as linked to changing conventions of landscape photography, activist photography, and American conflict photography. These images evince a number of concerns, often operating simultaneously and including communicating the physical and ecological realities of these landscapes, developing approaches that convey the meaning and the impact of invisible or diffuse pollutants and toxins, raising awareness about economic fallout and racial injustice as integral aspects of the landscape medium. The images ask us to consider the costs to life, society, and nature. Maybe also inspired by the creativity of these dedicated artists, we can also begin to imagine and work toward a more sustainable and just future. It is my pleasure to conclude now with the words from some of the featured photographers. Please enjoy this short video.
I was really confused about what I was going to do photographically. I mean, I was a young artist, and I decided that I was going to take the train to Peekskill, New York, and photograph Indian Point. And this happened in the winter of '78. I went like probably November, December, took those pictures of Indian Point that are in the nuclear survival kit. And then 3 Mile, when TMI happened, that pretty much generated my desire to, I was going to shut down all the nuclear power plants that I possibly could. And I was working at this copy shop on 8th Street, the Unsloppy Copy. And so I had access to these great Xerox machines. So whenever I would go and photograph a nuclear power plant, I would make a poster, and I would make up 200 posters, and I would go out at night and I would wheat paste them on the sides of buildings, on lampposts, where I could. And the nuclear survival kit, which I think I did in 1980, it was a little artist book. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just decided that I was going to make these postcards and I was going to turn them into this little artist book. But that's how that happened.
It's like, to me, it seemed like we were surrounded by industrial places in Perth Amboy when I was growing up. And it's the feeling was, if somebody drops a match at the wrong time, Perth Amboy is going to blow up. I mean, you smell the odors, and so, I had to make some kind of picture connecting with that.
They were cranking out depleted uranium for armor, and they did this for years. And they dumped some stuff, and they were told to clean it up, and then they didn't really clean it up. And who would have thought that you could be living in a suburb of a town like Concord and be next to a place that created killing products?
I think that photography can capture people's imagination, if you will. So, when we talk about sort of scientific research and experiencing some of these sites, like we've talked about, like this site is, extremely, polluted by radiation from the military, production of nuclear warheads. And it's like, you can say that sentence and you can read it, but actually seeing this sort of like pastoral image of a landscape, and it's sort of interrupted, with these strange objects. I think that for me, makes it more digestible is probably not the right word, but that's the word I'm going to use to the common person. And I think that I feel like my goal as an artist is to kind of capture people's imagination, and with that piece specifically, and I do it with a lot of my work, is that it's just out of sight. It's just behind a tree. There's this monitoring well that's monitoring, heavy duty radiological contamination. And it's like, that stuff is everywhere. And that's what this body of work has really made me discover, is that, to use the sort of common way of saying it, is it really is in our backyards. And a lot of it is hidden on purpose, not to be like it's not a conspiracy at all. They just don't want people talking about it and thinking about it more than we already do.
I photograph the cultural landscape, how we live with the land, how we try to impress our needs on the land. This whole idea that humans have dominion over, well, I choose to see that word as stewardship, not as ruling over, but taking care of.
Ruth Putter, the co-author with me on the book, told me about the encampment, which was actually about 40 miles from Syracuse. And she said, let's go out and photograph it. Right away, I saw, oh, this is historical. All these women coming from all over the country. They expected a couple hundred, they had thousands of people. And they bought the property next to the Seneca Army Depot so that they had a safe place to always come back to. No men were allowed on that property except in the front lawn. I mean, I actually found myself thinking, oh my God, this is so transforming. These folks were putting these pavilions together, setting up camp, making an outdoor kitchen, doing all this work all around creating a safe place for women to then go and march and protest these nuclear weapons.
However you define humanity, it does not include, on a spur of a moment, pressing a button and annihilating vast numbers of people. That is not human. It's something else.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I hope that you will visit and enjoy the exhibition as well. Martha, any last words?
Makeda, thank you so much. That was an incredibly powerful presentation, which is making me feel personally kind of devastated right now. And so I guess jumping off from that, I invite our audience to stay with us in the course of the next few months. We will have other programs related to this very compelling project, in which we'll be able to look at both the nuanced and more gut-wrenching messages and calls to action from this exhibition. For now, I just want to thank you all for tuning in. I want to congratulate Makeda for a real labor of love. I want to congratulate the artists who have been involved, who are really helping to move our own understanding and consciousness. And I invite all of you to continue to tune in. If you happen to be in travelable distance to the Harvard Art Museums, we hope that you will see the show in person, which is a very dynamic and important experience if you can give yourself that. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next program.